my thesis proposal. No? So let's start. My abstract is this one. Martin Buber is a Jewish existentialist philosopher who was known for his idea of intersubjectivity. So his I, it, and I, thou relationship, which was the center of his philosophy, would also play a part in his idea of education. The improvements in education in the shape of focus from teacher-centered to learner-centered learning, various teaching techniques have been introduced. One of these teaching techniques is what we call modular learning. So while the traditional way of learning is usually done in the classroom, modular learning is a more flexible setup and lessons are given through the use of what we call modules. This thesis aims to, or this research aims to talk about Martin Buber's idea of an education based on dialogue, and it would also want to inquire whether modular learning presents a monologic tendency. So the keywords of my research is, of course, Martin Buber, education, modular learning, and monologic tendency. So uh, we are all, I don't know if everyone is, but I think majority is familiar of um, modular learning since this is the path that the Department of Education, or I think even um said, no, is going since we have the pandemic. Although I did not think of this because it is the pandemic. No, hindi ko siya naisip kasi meron tayong pandemya, and um kaya ako naisip dahil nagmo-modular learning tayo. I really wanted to to talk about this, and in the lens of Martin Buber's philosophy, which is based on dialogue. Diba? If you are familiar with Martin Buber's idea of intersubjectivity, meron tayong I, it, and I, thou relationship. So how does it relate to his idea of education, and how can we see modular learning in the lens of Martin Buber's philosophy? So since modular learning is a new, 'di ba? It is a new type of way of teaching, 'di ba? Since for example now we can't proceed with the traditional way of teaching, which is inside the classroom. We are we have what we call Zoom meetings, or if you're in the senior high school level or in the primary level or secondary, students are given what we call modules. Tapos inuuwi nila, it is given to them and they take it home, and then they answer the modules through maybe with the help of their parents or with their self study. So yun yung aim ng thesis ko, ay ng research ko, kung makakita ba ng monologic tendencies yung sa modular learning. Okay, so research topic yan, idea of education in Martin Buber, which is close to his of course, to his idea of intersubjectivity, the I, it, and I, thou relationship. So, and of course, modular learning. So, ano ba yung problem na meron ako, the research topic that I have, the research problem that I have. So, this research aims to answer whether or not monologic tendencies exist in modular learning. No, so, what is modular learning? What are the post advantages and disadvantages of modular learning? No, and then we also have what is Martin Buber's idea of education, and how do we determine monologic and dialogic tendencies in education? And does modular learning have monologic tendencies, which is the main problem of my research. So the outline, yung balak kong outline for my research is of course introduction, chapter 1, and which would include the RRL, and of course your thesis problems, to be followed by chapter 2, which would talk about modular learning, a background on modular learning, advantages of modular learning, and its disadvantages. So to be followed by the third chapter, which would talk about the idea of education of Martin Buber, Meron tayong two types of educators. So what he calls the old and new types of educators. And then we would talk about his dialogic education or an education based on dialogue. And we talk about requisites for monologic tendency. So ano ba yung nag-ano to know if there is a monologic tendency. And to be followed by a synthesis no, sa chapter 4, yung extent of freedom and authority in modular learning. Modular learning, old or new tradition, and monologue and dialogue in modular learning to be followed by the conclusion and maybe recommendation. So yun po yung outline ng research ko. Currently, I am writing the chapters about it since nagkaroon po ng problems na I had to change some of it. Kaya I'm still in the process of writing the chapters. So that is my that's what I would want to research about. So yung title ko po is just a working title. Wala pa po akong mismong title for my research. However, of course, it would be needed. So sooner or later, I'd have to think of a title. Okay, so yun po yung research ko. It's about Martin Buber and his um, modular learning. So thank you po. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gerard. I think the floor
Thank you
is
po.
now open for your questions. You can type your questions in the chat box, or you can also feel free to open your microphones.
Hello, Gerard. Venus, can I ask a
Hello
question?
po.
Yes, sir.
Good evening po, Doc.
Hello, good evening,
Good
Gerard.
evening po.
Okay, so firstly, thank you for presenting your thesis proposal, or at least your working thesis proposal. Of course, one of the main purposes of a work in progress seminar is for our grad students to find an opportunity to get the um, uh, opinion or the suggestions or recommendations of the department, the faculty of the department, and also whoever is participating in the work in progress. So, in other words, our aim is for you, the graduate student, to help to or rather, we are trying to help you conceptualize your work, right?
Yes.
So, uh, so it's so it's in other words, given that a work presented in a work in progress is a work in progress. uh so I was just I'm trying to now my question is, I'm trying to understand what you're trying to do in your proposed thesis, aside from uh, uh, the fact that you mentioned that you're trying to look into the possibility, or look into modular learning and the possibility of ano yun, sinabi mo dyan, yung
Monologic tendencies po.
monologic tendencies. uh I'm not it's not clear, aside from that, it's not clear whether what you're trying to do is present a critique of modular learning using or not exactly using Buber, but later on Buber enters the picture, and you're going to argue that his dialogical you know, model uh, is an alternative. Or you can even argue that that dialogical aspect of human relations is absent in monologic teaching. So it's not clear. In other words, it's not yet clear. It's not, you have not articulated it clearly uh, yet, at least in you know, in your presentation. So yeah, we're here to help you try to elaborate, try to clarify what you're trying to do exactly. Um, so what is it that you're trying to do? Are you going to present a critique of monologic? And first, what is what do you mean by monologic tendency or monological tendencies? What do you mean by that? Um, and by telling us what you mean by that, then perhaps it will help us uh, see whether it's worth criticizing or not, di ba?
Yes po.
So yun, yeah, that's my first point. That's my first point. My second point is why don't you just, because it's an MA thesis, right? Why don't you just write on Buber and focus on, if there is I'm not familiar, or I'm not yet aware, or I'm not aware rather, whether Buber has a philosophy of education, or I might have heard of it, I might have read something about it in the past, pero usually we don't talk about it. So it's a relatively new area, right? So because it's a relatively new area, then I encourage you to work on it. My only point is, maybe it will benefit you more if you just focus on Buber and his theory of education in relation to, or maybe you can uh, reconstruct a theory of education based on Buber's works, and specifically based on his theory of intersubjective relations. And I'm not saying that
Mm.
you cannot talk about.
Oo.
I'm not saying that you cannot talk about monologue or modular education, pero baka pwedeng gawin mong example lang yon, no? Not necessarily a central uh, aspect of your thesis, because Buber should be the central aspect of your thesis. And since you're talking about education, modular learning, if you see something wrong about modular learning, then you can present that as an example, perhaps in one of your maybe your last chapter. Do you understand? Do you get what I'm saying? Parang baka kasi hindi mo matapos pagka uh, because those are two big topics, right? Buber on the one hand, and then modular learning on the other hand. Uh, but you are writing a thesis in philosophy. So my suggestion is, I if I were your advisor, I'd rather insist that you work on Buber, no? And like I said, if you can if you can reconstruct a theory of education or pedagogy by reading Buber, that's a relatively new area. So yun yung aking suggestion sa'yo. Oh, and then yeah, I had a question earlier, right? Yung pangalawa is more like a suggestion.
Yung about monologic tendencies po, Doc. If it shows a tendency to be monologic po. Kasi 'di ba when we say dialogue, it usually involves you and someone that you're talking to. 'Di ba? It becomes a dialogue when both of you communicate. and it's only a monologue if it's just you or the other person talking and then no one is listening. So it's very important
But
na
do you really need Buber to be able to say that?
that's ano po kasi idea po kasi ni Buber yung
Yeah, but
talk.
there's something more to Buber than simply that dialogue or communication is based on the dialogue between two people. It's not a monologue, right? There are other philosophers who say that too. But there's more to Buber than that, communicative structure or intersubjective relation. Uh, Kasi it's quite straightforward that if you are having a dialogue, you're dialoguing with another person. Or when you dialogue with yourself, that's more of a monologue. Or you pretend to dialogue or to talk with other people, but actually it's more of a self-reflexive monologue. So it's more of a monologue than a dialogue. In other words, para sa akin, you don't need Buber to be able to say that. But your main focus as a philosophy student writing a thesis in philosophy is to write a thesis in philosophy. So my recommendation is uh, I'd rather focus on Buber, and reconstruct a theory of education or pedagogy. That to me is a thesis in philosophy. In other words, ipakita mo yung lalim nung sinasabi ni Buber. Ano yung ibig sabihin, ano ang ibig niyang sabihin sa intersubjective relation, and so on and so. What are the ethical ramifications? What are the political ramifications? Social ramifications? And then you find these ramifications in a specific social area we call education. Uh, Kasi mamaya masyadong thin. Later on, you're going to present a thinly written thesis on Buber. You get the idea? You can still talk about modular learning later on. Pero sa tingin ko isang maliit lang na aspeto yan dapat ng thesis mo. Hindi dapat yung central focus ng thesis mo. Your job really as an MA student is to be is to rather to now that you're writing your thesis and eventually you're going to defend your thesis, your job is to demonstrate that you are not just familiar with the ideas of Buber, but you're actually a master of these ideas. That's what the word master means in in a master's in philosophy, or in a master's on in whatever area. In other words, dapat malalim, medyo malalim yung pagkakaunawa mo kay Buber. So kasi you can submit a paper that later on would appear like parang method lang si Buber, right? Yun ang gusto kong iwasan sana ng mga thesis writers sa philosophy, yung parang they pick a philosopher, Buber, intersubjective philosophy, or let's say phenomenology, and they pretend to apply it on a specific problem. My problem with that is it would appear as if secondary lang yung philosophy. Kasi what is phenomenology if not just one of the methods that you can use to write a thesis? Parang ganun nangyayari. What is the IDAW relationship pagka ginagamit mo lang siya just to understand you know, in this case, yung specific learning style or teaching style, ba? Sa tingin ko dapat mas malalim yung pagpresenta mo at and that's the only way you can present that you are actually that you have an in-depth in-depth grasp of the philosopher. If you're able to focus really on the work of the philosopher. Um, um, Anyway, sige. What is your reaction to that? And I'd love to hear the comments of the others also.
Doc, ano po, kasi po ang plan ko po talaga is, 'di ba po, I would talk about the idea of Buber in a chapter. So there's a chapter dedicated to Martin Buber's philosophy, the idea of education. Kasi yung idea po niya ng education is based on an education on dialogue. So dialogic education. So parang ang gagawin ko po is I'll have a chapter dedicated to Martin Buber's idea, and then I'll have a chapter talking about the different aspects of modular learning. Pero ang ano po, in the end, I will answer the question whether um, may nagkakaroon ba ng tendency na maging one-sided yung modular learning, no, which is one that an idea na kumbaga parang ni-reject ni Buber kasi meron po siya tinatawag na dalawang klaseng educators, yung old tradition, which is um old tradition, which is yung traditional learning na kung saan yung teacher lang yung nagtuturo, tapos kung ano yung fini-feed ng teacher, yun lang yung gagawin ng student. So walang freedom, walang voice yung student in that kind of tradition. While in the new tradition, or what he calls the free school, yun yung hinahayaan po mag-develop on their own yung students, and then the educators are reduced to what we call only facilitator. So ang ginagawa lang ng teachers, magbibigay lang sila ng activities ganito, ganyan, and then they would let the students develop on their own. So kinontra din ni Buber yon kasi nga masyado namang free yung development ng student. Ang need niya daw ng student, according to him, is guidance from the educator. So yung ipinromote yun na type of education is an education that involves both the student and the educator. So yung idea niya is the teacher will not influence totally yung idea ng student kasi the student itself can develop on their own. So they have the capability to develop. However, the teacher is there to guide them. So yung teacher hindi siya nare-reduce na lang simply as someone that is facilitating, no. The role of the educator is still there. However, hindi na siya katulad din ng dati na puro authority lang, na kung ano yung sinabi ng teacher, kung ano yung sasabihin ko, halimbawa I teach in a classroom, yun lang yung masusunod. So in the educative process, he wants that both the educator and the student is involved. So yun po yung iano ko sa modular learning, kung na-involve ba talaga yung teacher or na-involve ba talaga yung student? Do they have what we call dialogic communication? Are they hindi ba nasasapawan lang ng gusto ng teacher yung ginagawa ng student, or at the same time, hindi ba hinahayaan na lang ng mga teacher yung student na matuto on their own. So yun po yung gusto kong makita in modular learning. That is why I wanted to write about
Yeah.
this po.
Well, siguro before, kasi maraming mga nagko-comment, and of course you would love to read their comments. But isang point na lang, Gerard. I don't have any problem with that, but you can do that in an article. My worry is whether that can actually constitute or pass as a thesis, an MA thesis in philosophy. So if well, you mentioned that you're going to write a chapter on Buber, but I don't think one chapter is enough to be able to call it a philosophy, a thesis, an MA thesis in philosophy. So parang it's something that you can work out with your advisor. Pero para sa akin, sa tingin ko, dapat mabigat yung discussion mo on Buber. In other words, one chapter is not enough. Kaya, but if you're going to strategize a bit, if we have 4 chapters or 3 chapters, 2 chapters, if you have 3 chapters, then 2 chapters should be devoted to Buber, and only 1 chapter should be devoted to yours. Actually, what you're trying to do is a case study, right? Pero a case study can be done, can be written in an article form, not necessarily a thesis. So yun lang yung concern ko, kasi you are going to defend a thesis in philosophy. Kaya sa tingin ko, dapat mas mabigat yung Buber mo kaysa yung case study part. Mas malalim dapat yung yung discussion mo kay Buber. You are, and then not only that, kasi you have to survey, kasi you cannot really you cannot isolate Buber from other other theories of education that also mention or use intersubjectivity. Marami yan. It's not just Buber. And what kind of intersubjectivity does he mean? Kasi if you even look at philosophy, P4C, or you not on, well, not malawak rin yung P4C, but just look at Lippmann, for example. Dialogical din naman yung kay Lippmann, right? So what differentiates Lippmann's dialogical theory of education from Buber's dialogical theory of education? Sa tingin ko nga, dapat yun ang ginagawa mong thesis, yung parang survey noon, yung dialogical theories of education, right? Sa tingin ko, mas magandang thesis yun sa philosophy. But later on, kaya nga siguro in a section in your last chapter, you can talk about the the problems with modular learning. You get the idea? Yung parang dapat, kasi philosophy thesis yung sinusulat mo eh. Hindi naman siya may applied aspect siya, pero sa tingin ko yung the way even the way you are explaining it, it's quite convincing, pero pwede mong sabihin yan sa isang maikling papel. Sige.
Thank you, Sir Pao.
Hello?
Sir
May I, Venus?
Sir, let's just read the suggestions first po. In the comment section. You have here, Gerard, two suggestions from Sir Einstein. I think baka makatulong, Gerard, kung mas titignan mo ang mismong modular na inaaral, mas maging malawak din mismo ang pagtukoy dito dahil iba't iba rin ang ginagawang paraan ng DepEd dito. May mga guro na pumupunta rin kasi sa mga nayon at barabarangay para kamustahin ang mga bata. Ang takot ko ay mauwi ang pagtukoy sa isang one-to-one correspondence sa idea ng edukasyon ni Buber. Maybe you have some response. Did you consider this?
Yes po, I will consider po yung suggestion po ni Sir Meharo po. I will look into that po.
So you also have two more. I think Dr. Bolaños is asking if were you able to observe how modular classes are done?
Ako kasi po currently po I actually kaka-resign ko lang pero I worked with University of Makati and yung ginawa po nila ngayon is they call blended learning. So isa rin po ako sa gumawa ng modules, no. So I also made modules for the students for the semester. So kakatapos na po ng SEM namin. Gumawa po kami ng modules and then I myself experienced firsthand yung pagbibigay ng modules and then merong asynchronous learning. So yun din po yung nakita ko dun sa experience ko dun sa nakaraang SEM na ayun nga po parang nagiging distant yung pagdi-discuss ng lessons. And ayun po, so I agree na meron pong monologic tendencies dun sa nangyayari. So, yes po.
Thank you, Gerard. I think Dr. Aguas has a question and then Dr. Carino.
Oh yeah, thank you. Thank you, Venus. Hi, Gerard.
Good evening po, Doc.
I hope you are listening to the comments, especially of Dr. Bolaños.
Yes po.
Nagsusulat
po.
Yeah, you're reading the comments here in the chat box.
Yes po.
Noong una, yung gusto mong gawin ay yung K-12. Sabi ko sa iyo, sobrang laki nun.
Yes po, Doc.
Focus ka ngayon sa modular. Sinasabi nila, malaki pa rin yan. So, really you have to focus on the philosophy aspect of more on Buber. Kasi parang although meron philosophy of education talaga si Buber, at siguro ang tingin mo medyo marami-rami na rin yung nasusulat diyan. Kaya gusto mo siguro i-apply yung yung philosophy of education ni Buber una doon sa K-12, ngayon sa modular. Pero yun nga, ang problema mo diyan, una, ano yung magiging source mo ng modular kasi nga marami. Kahit na meron ka ng experience sa modular, hindi naman lang yun yung klase ng modular na education. Tapos, pangalawa dyan, dahil doon na babaling yung attention mo, yung interest mo sa education, ang labas yung thesis mo sa education, hindi sa philosophy or sa methods, no? Kaysa doon sa philosophy. So sa akin, ang suggestion ko nga sa iyo, focus more on Buber. Palalimin mo yung discussion mo on Buber, especially yung kanyang concept ng dialogue. Kasi although marami nang nasulat diyan kay Buber, kailangan mo pa ring palalimin 'yan. Halimbawa, kung sa thesis lang naman, no. Really focus on the yung sinasabi ni Buber na two kinds of educators. Tapos siguro kung gusto mo talagang ilagay diyan yung modular, gawin mo siyang example ng isang ng isang klase ng education na kinikritik ni Buber. So focus on the philosophy of education of Buber at saka yung kanyang critique doon sa mga iba't ibang klase ng yung tinatawag niyang iba't ibang klase ng education, no? Na yung sabi mo nga, hindi siya dialogic kundi monologic. Kasi pag tinignan mo naman talaga yung yung modular, alam naman natin magiging monologic talaga yun eh, no? Pero paano mo palalabasin na monologic yun as against doon sa dialogic na sinasabi ni Buber? Kaya kailangan mo palabasin yung dialogic na education ni Buber. At doon mo kailangan talaga mag-focus. Ano? Yun ang dapat mong i-develop. Yung monologic o yung modular na gusto mong isulat ay para siyang counter example. Pero hindi siya yung pinaka-main na magiging focus mo, no? Focus on the philosophy of education, the dialogic philosophy of education ni Buber. And then kung gusto mo lang isama yung monologic doon, magiging parang example or counter example siya nung philosophy of education ni Buber. And kailangan mo pang palalimin talaga yung understanding mo kay Buber, no? Kasi hindi yan nadadala lang sa pag-distinguish ng monologic at dialogic. Masyadong malalim yung philosophy ni Buber para lang, alam mo yun, hindi pwede basta ano lang eh, parang may mga general statements ka lang nasasabihin tapos yun na yun. Kaya ang kadalasan nami-misinterpret. Kasi pag sabi mo kanina na dialogue kasi dalawa yung nag-uusap, monologue kasi isa lang ang nagsasalita. Totoo nga naman, hindi mo kailangan si Buber kung ganoon lang naman ang sasabihin mo. No? Pero pag binasa mo yung kanyang Between Man and Man, pag binasa mo yung kanyang I and Thou, pag binasa mo yung kanyang Knowledge of Man, pag binasa mo yung halimbawa yung mga commentaries halimbawa ni Friedman, ni Murphy, lalalim yung pag-intindi mo kay Buber. Kaya advice ko palagi sa iyo, magbasa ka pa, magbasa at magbasa pa. Ayun lang, Gerard.
Yes po, Doc. Thank you po, Doc.
Thank you, Dr. Aguas. I think Dr. Carino also has a concern.
Salamat, Venus, and thank you, Gerard. Actually,
Good evening po.
wala naman akong madadagdag na doon sa nabanggit ni Doc Job and Sir Pao earlier. Siguro, I'm not sure kung meron pa bang second round ito? Are you going to present in another session after this?
Sabi po, dun sa schedule nakalagay po na meron pa.
Yun. Kasi kung meron pa, Gerard, this is more on, hindi ito sa substance na nabanggit na ni Sir Pao at saka ni Sir Job. Baka sa susunod, following what has been suggested to you by our senior colleagues, baka sa susunod, ang pwede mong ipakita dito, sa mga nakikinig sa iyo, yung produkto ng iyong review of related lit. Kasi madaling magkwento eh. Madaling magsabi ng ito ang gusto kong gawin. Pero since this is an MA thesis, nabanggit natin na Sir Pao kanina, this should be grounded on previous and current scholarship. Sinasabi rin yun ni Sir Job sa iyo a while ago. Baliwala yung abstract kung wala kang maayos na review of related lit. Actually, magkadikit yung dalawa na yon. You can only, I mean, your abstract is as good only as your review of related lit. So siguro next time around, even if you don't talk about the structure and your aims for writing your thesis, baka pwede mong i-share sa amin, what have you read? What have you discovered? Not only about Buber, but also specifically about his philosophy of education. And you might surprise yourself na baka later on ma-realize mo na hindi mo kailangan ng modular learning to talk about Buber. Baka kasi in your attempt to really work on modular learning, baka yung pa yung makasira sa interest mo kay Buber. Definitely, when it comes to MA thesis, Buber is more important than modular learning.
Yes po.
Pwede natin pag-usapan sa kwentuhan yung modular learning pero your take on Buber, yun yung in-expect sa iyo bilang isang potential MA degree holder. And that will earn you your degree. Hindi yung modular learning part. Lalo ngayon sa panahon ito, parang kahit sino-sino na lang gumagawa ng module. Pero yung what you can share about Buber as a scholar, as a graduate scholar, only you can do it. Kaya sana seryosohin mo yung pag-aaral kay Buber. Yun lang, Gerard. Thank you, Dinos.
Yes po, Doc. Thank you po.
Thank you, Sir Jovi. I think we can entertain one more question or one more feedback if any of you would like to talk.
Hello?
Sir Aguas po.
Yeah,
Yes,
okay, thank you, Venus. Gerard, mahaba, nasa 70 pages yung review of literature mo.
Yes po, Doc.
Tingnan mo doon. Tingnan mo yung mga ni-review mo doon kasi pwede ka na makakuha ng ano doon no? Tingnan mo yung mga ni-review mo mga secondary sources, and then at the same time, wag lang yung secondary sources. Subisid ka talaga kasi doon sa primary sources.
Yes po, yes po.
Para meron kang makikita doon. At yun nga, tama yung sinasabi ni Dr. V. Baka hindi mo na nga kailangan yung modular. Pero kung gusto mo i-insist yan, yun nga, parang example lang.
That's an example.
Oo. Kasi nakikita ko yung interest mo doon kasi galing ka doon sa pagtuturo sa high school, yun ang ginawa mo. Siguro gusto mo ring isama yun doon sa thesis mo, pero hindi naman kailangan i-insist mo na yun mismo ang aaralin mo. No? Kasi hindi ka naman nagsusulat ng thesis sa education. No? Susulat ka ng thesis sa philosophy. So yung philosophy ni Buber ang ang karirin mo. Tapos yung modular, lang, parang example, no? Ayun lang. Thank you. Thank you, Venus.
Thank you po, Doc. Thank you po.
Thank you, everyone, for your questions. Meron pa po bang gustong humabol?
Hello. Ako si...
Yes po.
Yes. Bisita lang po. Ako po si James, Research Assistant sa School of Sciences and Engineering sa UNP. Hindi ako philosophy major, so possible na redundant yung suggestion ko po na ito. Pero anyway, sabihin ko na lang. Maybe ang gusto po ata ng mga seniors is yung in-depth kay Buber. So maybe you may restructure your research objectives in such a way na magiging necessary talaga na magkaroon ka ng in-depth analysis kay Buber or other philosophers. Maybe ewan ko, pero maybe ang dabas ata is nagiging parang additional details lang ata yung in-depth analysis kay Buber, pero parang pwede ata na hindi parang short description lang ni Buber yung kailangan. So I think yun, restructuring ng research objective para maging necessary siya. Ayun lang. Thank you.
Thank you po, thank you po.
Thank you, Sir James. Anyone else? Okay. I think that concludes Gerard's presentation. Thank you very much, Gerard, for your presentation.
Thank you po. May nakita pa po akong isang comment po sa chat. Galing po kay Jillian po.
Ay,
no?
sorry. Yes po.
Yung perhaps the suggestion for me, maybe it's not a question of whether monologic tendency in modular learning exists, but whether the monologue has positive or negative effects in modular learning. So thank you po for the suggestion. And also I asked where would you get your sources for this topic? Yun po, journal article, since yun nga po, nasabi na it's very broad, it's wide. Hindi siya nag-focus on a particular place. No? So I took journal articles, sources from other countries then that talked about their model of modular learning. So yun po yung ilagay ko din, bala ko ilagay sa RRL. So ayun po yung sabi ni Doc na umabot ng 70 pages was because I talked about Buber and then a part of Philippine Edu. Yung dun po sa dati kong proposal, which was also broad. So yung ngayon, itatry ko sana i-ano yung modular learning. So I took sources from the studies or articles. So may, kadalasan yun nga yung may nagiging yung mga case studies ng how they apply their modular learning. No, halimbawa, in other countries such as Finland, Ethiopia. So may mga nakita akong examples nun sa Indonesia din. So I took sources from these other places. So yun po, dun ko nakuha yung ibang sources niya. And of course, books. No? However, yung mahirap sa books is since yung ibang libro hindi siya available digitally, yun yung pinahirapan ko sa research since yung ibang books hindi ko ma-access since walang digital copy. And since pandemic nga mahirap makuha. So ayun po yung answer. So yun po. Thank you po.
Okay, hello.
Hello po.
Okay, is there meron pa po bang would like to raise their questions? And if none, we would like to thank Gerard for his presentation as well. And okay, yes. So for our next presenter for tonight will be Miss Venus A. Basa. She will be talking about epistemic injustice in the light of the framework of philosophy for children and community of inquiry. Ma'am Venus, you may start whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Andre. So what I will be presenting tonight, good evening po, is a stretched out abstract. So this is my abstract for thesis writing 1 for TW1. I just supplemented some definitions and examples in trying to make the concepts clearer for everyone. Malinaw naman po.
Yes po, malinaw po.
Thank you po. So I'm looking forward to everyone's feedback, and later on maybe you can help me have a clearer idea on how to go about my research. My working title is Understanding Epistemic Injustice in Children through the P4CCOI framework, or the Philosophy for Children dash Community of Inquiry framework. Um, in recent years, the philosophical community has been increasingly attracted to the concept of epistemic injustice as articulated by Miranda Fraker. Epistemic injustice occurs when someone is wronged, specifically in their capacity as a knower. And as early as now, I would like to emphasize that experiencing epistemic injustice is experiencing an insult. I quote, "The intrinsic wrong of testimonial injustice is the epistemic insult. The subject is undermined in their capacity as a knower, and so as a rational being. And this insult goes deep. If we accept that our rationality is part of the essence of human beings' distinctive value, then to be perceived and treated as lesser in one's capacity as a knower is to be perceived and treated as a lesser human being." So, Fricker provides two kinds of epistemic injustice: testimonial injustice and hermeneutical injustice. Testimonial injustice occurs when prejudice causes a hearer to give a deflated level of credibility to a speaker's word. Hermeneutical injustice occurs at a prior stage when a gap in collective interpretive resources puts someone at an unfair disadvantage and when it comes to making sense of their social experiences. For example, of the first one of testimonial injustice might be when the police do not believe you because you are black, or maybe in the Philippines when you are poor or you look poor, the police or institutions around you will not easily believe you, but richer people, or more attractive people actually are automatically given credibility when they are trying to say something. An example of the second might be that you suffer sexual harassment in a culture that still lacks that critical concept. So let's say before, women might not be able to articulate why being catcalled is uncomfortable, or why unwelcomed attention and unwelcomed physical touches are not comfortable too. Kasi before nga wala pa naman yung critical concept na yun, wala pa naman tayong PC culture in a way. So we might say that testimonial injustice is caused by prejudice in the economy of credibility, and that hermeneutical injustice is caused by structural prejudice in the economy of collective hermeneutical resources. Although Fricker's contextualization of the notion is heavily grounded on race and gender, it is not surprising that current research trends appropriate the concept to children, albeit for me, more complicatedly and more controversially. After all, children are not usually seen as whole persons, but as potential adults, potential persons, potential rational human beings. One of the questions in my thesis is whether children can be considered as being epistemically oppressed, or maybe is society's skepticism on children's credibility as knowers rightfully justified given their natural limitations and limited experiences. So, the thesis will provide an exegesis of the epistemic injustice experienced by children in general. So, these are the current research trends that I've seen, that I've encountered so far. When we talk about epistemic injustice in children, medically as patients, children's credibility as giver of information is often considered as unreliable, or worse, sometimes their aches and pains are brushed off as acting lang based on their age. Legally, the literature here focuses on how jurors perceive child witnesses, but I believe it is also relevant on how social workers and other government agencies treat children's epistemic credibility. I am not yet sure if I will put education under this category when it comes to curriculum building and deciding the content of what we include in schools, etc. So culturally, I don't have yet very strong literature for this. I am still working on general cultural assumptions which, although are present almost universally, I think we can agree that in the Philippines, papunta ka pa lang, pabalik na ako, is still the prevalent attitude towards children's epistemic credibility. In fact, even when you're actually a full-grown adult or human being, your credibility is still easily destroyed when one argues that mas matanda ako sa'yo and I know better. So, but looking at epistemic injustice from the perspective of P4C COI is still heavily unexplored. So far, with the literature I've encountered, P4C COI is almost always mentioned in passing when researchers try to cite spaces wherein children can be considered as safer or further from experiencing epistemic injustice. The practices of P4CCOI are usually offered as a kind of counterculture when dealing with the prevalent epistemic injustice children are suffering. However, it seems to me that epistemic injustice in children is yet to be critically analyzed with the lens of P4CCOI, and this is what the thesis sets out to do. So, in a way, research trends po kasi with these two frameworks, P4CCOI and even epistemic injustice, they have evolved into something very practical na. So, if you notice, with regard to epistemic injustice, they're already applying it legally, medically, and I have a ton of research on that. And even with P4CCOI, the researches within the P4CCOI framework, they have also evolved into something very practical. Nasa case studies na and application, actual classroom examples and experiences. So, nandoon na yung researches. So, what I'm trying to do is to merge, to see epistemic injustice through P4CCOI, but at the same time, maybe elevate the discussion and go back to, to the philosophies behind these two ideas. Um, the thesis will also argue that an adaptation of the community of inquiry framework, critically anchored on philosophy for with children and philosophy of childhood, has the capacity to interrupt such deep-rooted injustice. I will highlight how the immanent dialogical process of the COI pedagogy, along with its sensitivity to positionality, creates a space for children to be heard and included in society building. The thesis will also strive to be faithful to the dialogical process itself. At the end of the project, we shall also locate spaces within the P4C COI framework that are susceptible to epistemic injustice, and how P4C COI, with the elements inside it, is actually capable of correcting itself in such instances. It is the hopeful remark of this project that if P4C COI is adapted as a master educational program, societies of the future will transform, if not without, with significantly less epistemic oppression to go around. I thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ma'am Venus, for your presentation on P4C and epistemic injustice. So the floor is now open uh, for questions and comments regarding the paper. You may simply unmute or put your comments in the chat box. Thank you.
Good evening.
Sir, hindi ko pa na-catch sino po ulit yung nag-ano.
Peter Paul po.
Sir Peter, sige po. Go ahead po.
Hi Venus, good evening. And good evening po sa
Evening
lahat.
po.
I'd like to ask Venus, no, ano nga po yung main problem ng thesis niyo po? And then towards the end of your presentation earlier, I heard you na you wanted to elevate the discussions pertaining to epistemic injustice and P4CCOI and you wanted to go back to the philosophies and assumptions behind these two concepts or practices. Uh, ano pong ibig sabihin nito, Venus? Yun lang po sa ngayon. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Peter. The main I don't have like a fixed thesis problem po, no. The problem I guess would be that there is epistemic injustice in children, and current research tries to apply epistemic injustice was articulated by Miranda Fricker. Tapos they have been trying to appropriate the idea of epistemic injustice in children, but I think that what I can offer is the research gap that I found. So I saw that they have been trying to appropriate epistemic injustice in children, but I have not seen any work that has used P4C-COI as a framework in trying to really understand or to make sense or to articulate this epistemic injustice that children are actually um, experiencing. Kasi nga, P4C-COI, maybe within the world of P4C-COI, epistemic injustice maybe doesn't, parang taboo siya in a way, kasi nga merong elements within P4C-COI na mahirap palabasin or hindi basta-basta lalabas yung epistemic injustice kasi nga meron siyang elements within it like the dialogical process, its sensitivity to positionality, etc. So, what the thesis will try to do is to really try to analyze epistemic injustice in children using the elements of P4C-COI. With regard to the elevation of the discussion, what I meant was the current research that I found. Kasi nga po matagal na yung framework, 'di ba? So, and it's actually an educational pedagogy. So, most researches that I found were already trying to apply the pedagogy in schools and in actual classrooms, and then so parang ano na siya, quantitative qualitative na siya in a sense. So actual experiences na siya from the ground. What I would like to do is go back to these elements which I mentioned earlier, the imminent dialogical process of P4C, their sensitivity to positionality, of course, multidimensional thinking, and the capacity of P4C to self-correct. So those four elements, the unique play of those four elements, I would like to focus on that, on those concepts, on those ideas, and then also connect them or use them to understand epistemic injustice na naka-root din dun sa actual writings ni Fricker, and hindi lang po hindi lang nakabase doon um sa current researches na very practical na. That's what I meant with trying to, elevate the discussion again. Ayun po.
Thank you, Venus.
Hello, Andre, may I ask a question?
Hi, Doc. Go ahead po. Thank you.
Hello, Venus. How are you?
Hi, sir. Okay po.
Yeah, if I get it correctly, what you're trying to do is you're going to present, of course, your main problem is epistemic injustice among children, right?
Yes,
And
sir.
what you're trying to do is basically is that you're going to present philosophy for children slash community of inquiry as a remedy um, uh, a remedy to epistemic injustice, right? So you're not necessarily arguing that there is epistemic injustice uh, in community of inquiry, but it's the other way around. You're actually going to present it as a remedy to epistemic injustice. So that's how I get your, if I got it correctly, that's how I understand your project, right?
Um, can I respond na, sir? Doon lang po sa part na yun.
Yeah.
It's interesting that you brought this up because I mean yung term na remedy, because initially I had this very grand idea of saying that I'm going to abolish epistemic injustice, through the
Yeah,
paper
yeah. I don't think
CCOI
you can.
never.
I don't think you can. I don't think one philosopher can. I
Yes.
call this can. To get rid of epistemic injustice. Otherwise, if we've gotten rid of, if we are ever successful in getting rid of epistemic injustice, that's also the end of philosophy.
Opo, sir.
Uh, so anyway, sige. And then I
Opo,
have
so,
another question after
opo,
your.
sir, so from having this grand idea of abolishing epistemic injustice, I actually bumaba ako dun sa hope that it will just interrupt
Mm,
epistemic injustice. One of the biggest questions I have here in my paper actually is, and so what? So what if I look at epistemic injustice through paper CCOI? And I came to the idea that, well, maybe it will get interrupted. And I think that that's enough for me.
all
The
right.
thesis, so
So
yun po.
if I may revise my term, then if we're not going to, if it's not a remedy, then it's more of, let's use some parang a humble term like critique, right? It's more of a critique of epistemic injustice. Yeah. So yeah, that's how I understand your project. The other question is about, you mentioned something in your presentation, no, yung kasi when you say it appeared as if uh, it's difficult to draw the line between childhood. Anyway, in the way you presented it, no, I might be wrong, but and I'd like you to clarify and help me understand. uh, it is as if it's difficult to I call this to find a demarcation then between being a child and being, let's say, a rational adult. Of course, children are rational. Uh, 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 and as a parent, I understand that, that mas marami pang alam yung, I mean, even logically, no, my child has solutions to complex things that, na hindi ko naiisip ko minsan. And of course, I appreciate that. And it just proves that children can think, right? But there are also and because they can think, then we have to entertain them, we have to accept them and listen to them and learn from them. But the way you presented it, it is as if we should not demarcate anymore between being a child and being an adult, an adult who can I call this make decisions. In other words, if that's how we present it, then we might as well just say that children like 5 or even a 10-year-old child can make decisions on his own. So might as well abolish also the idea of I call this how do you call it again, yung right age, yung age of majority, is that how you call it, 18 above, right? Because that's the demarcation when we are legally, anyway, legally we can say that a person can already decide for him or for herself. So my question is, and I hope you can clarify that, kasi some and I'm actually just asking this on behalf of the others who might find it also confusing. So where do we draw the line then in the context of epistemic injustice? Where do we draw the line? When do we say that there are decisions that adults should make for children, right? And that I call this and that despite the fact that children are thinking beings or individuals, rational persons, they are already persons, but at the same time there are parang there are aspects of life that they are not yet from, I don't know, that they cannot decide on yet. I don't know if that is I don't know if that is if I'm making sense, if that is clear enough. Pero I do understand. I totally agree with you that there is some level of epistemic injustice, and not only in children, pero the examples that you presented, yes, the epistemic injustice is everywhere. Um, pero sige, Venus, maybe you can clarify. Maybe you can help me, answer this question. Where do we draw the line?
So I think it's maybe I wasn't able to include it here. I think what's important to understand in epistemic injustice is it is rooted from prejudice. Um, I am not going to advocate because I also have a daughter, and I'm never going to advocate that she can be left on her own, right? So, uh, but the idea of epistemic injustice is it happens when a hearer is prejudiced simply because of something like that. So, for example, I'm with the examples that I've given. So, we epistemically oppress children in a sense when we are not being responsible hearers in whatever they are trying to say, and that happens when we are prejudiced in what they are saying simply because they are younger than us. When that is the when that's the defining factor, I guess, or when that is the when age, I guess, is the standard for is your criteria rather. When age is your criterion for whether or not you're going to listen to someone, then that is when epistemic injustice happens. As I've mentioned, and I think it's interesting that you mentioned the demarcation between what a child is really, because in our class before in P4C, I actually remember thinking that, well, in the Philippines, if we try to contextualize everything, in the Philippines, people never actually stop becoming a child of their parents. In other cultures, there's this idea that when you are 18 years old, you are free and you're an adult, a full adult, and you can take care of, you can be on your own. But here in our culture, it doesn't matter how old you are. When you're talking to your parent, you will be forever that parent's child. And as I've mentioned, it's still prevalent in us that it ganun talaga yung kultura natin na kahit gaano ka pa katanda, actually sir, na pag sinabi sa'yo na mas matanda ako sa'yo, I know better, wala na, parang no more discussions. So, um, with regard to the age, I don't have an answer to that really, but I also mentioned here philosophy of childhood. And in philosophy of childhood, we are not just talking about children. In philosophy of childhood, actually, childhood is seen more as a mode of being. So it talks about the actual child and every other person's inner child. So childhood is a mode of being, ganun. Tapos I'm not sure though how relevant that is right now sa akin po. Ayun, sir. I'm sorry, medyo magulo po.
May I say something, Andre? Andre or Venus? Venus, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Nawala na si Andre.
Ay, Doc, hello, sorry po, hindi pala napindot. Go ahead po, Doc. And before that, thank you,
Sige,
Doc, as well.
I'm going to ask something sana kung tapos na si Sir Pao.
Yes, go ahead, Jovi.
Okay, salamat po, sir. Bino sa a handful of comments. Una, I'm not sure if I heard you right kanina, no, nang sinabi mong right now, parang there is a dearth of materials that study epistemic justice using community of inquiry or philosophy of children or for children rather as a critical lens. Tama ba yung pagkakadinig ko?
Sir, kulang po. Yun po yung wala po. Walang ganun masyado.
Okay.
They only offer P4C as a counterculture pa doon. Pero yan po.
Obviously, kaya ako naitanong yun. Obviously, mukhang hindi mo pa nabasa yung dissertation ni Peter Elicor. Na, by the way, good evening, Peter. And thank you for joining us tonight. Because Peter did that exactly. Using P4C and COI as critical lens to study epistemic justice. Read it dahil matapos naming basahin yon, natatakot ako para sa mga susunod na scholars on P4C or COI. Kasi they need to tell something that has not been said by Peter. Kaya if you are really serious on this theme, my first advice is to email Peter for a copy of his dissertation. Dahil that's monumental. And hindi lang monumental, siguro sa scholarship ng P4C or COI, like I said, anyone who wishes to write something on that needs to take Peter's words in consideration. So that's my first, it's not really a question but a suggestion siguro kasi marami kang mapupulot doon. Okay? The other thing that I have in mind is the way you describe your project. Ang dating sa akin, it remains an epistemological question rather than an ethical question. If it turns out to be that way, na you will treat epistemic justice as an epistemological question, then that's just another form of epistemic justice. Hindi ka nakakatulong doon sa cause ng ipinaglalaban mo if kung sakasakaling magkakaganon yon. I'm not saying this to discourage you. I'm just saying this to tell you na how do I call it? Medyo mahirap talaga yung project mo. Kasi nga parang I'm not sure if kung tama yung pagkakaintindi ko sa sinasabi ni Sir Pao kanina. Basically, Sir Pao is asking you for a context. Kasi the moment you deal with epistemic justice as a theoretical issue, like what I am hearing right now, yun yung sinasabi kong it remains an epistemological issue. And ang mangyayari, you won't be addressing the actual instances of epistemic justice. So sa tingin ko, kaya kailangan mo rin tingnan yung ginawa ni Peter. Successful si Peter kasi he was able to provide a very concrete context where epistemic justice is encountered. and where COI and P4C can actually be effective in responding to this. So siguro sa subsequent stages of your project, uh, you might want to consider what Serpa was saying a while ago. So if I wish to summarize what I'm trying to tell you, yun lang, yung in its current stage, mukhang the way you articulate the problem of epistemic justice remains parang highly epistemological rather than an ethical question. Thank you, Venus, and thank you, Andre.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Doc Jovi. Anyone else po? I would like to raise your questions po.
Andre, can I share some of my queries din kay Venus? Additional questions lang po.
Yes, sir. Yes
Okay po, go ahead po.
Yeah. Sir Jovi, thank you po sa sa comments po sa work ko. Thank you. Venus, may ipopost ako sa chat so that you
Yes, sir. Great. Yes, sir, Peter, I agree with the assumptions po. That, yan po mismo yung meaning ko.
Okay po, Sir Peter, do you have any other comment po regarding that?
I'm going to speak on behalf of Peter.
Okay po, go ahead po, Doc Pao.
Basahin mo yung aking dissertation, Venus.
Yes, sir. Actually, I've been reading Sir Peter's journal articles lang po. Hindi ko na-encounter yung dissertation niya. Pero yung articles ni Sir Peter, doon ko pinaka nakuha yung sensitivity to positionality.
Okay po, thank you. Siguro before we proceed to kung meron pang tanong.
Andre,
Okay
sorry.
po. Sige po, go ahead po, sir.
I've I've been talking, hindi ko napansin na nakamute pala ako, sorry. Ito po. Since nag-agree po si Venus sa assumptions na nakita ko, ang questions ko po is that number one, if you agree sa first assumption, then I think you're right. May ganong trend sa P4C literature that focuses on practice. But ang question ko nito is that what do you think you will find out in going back to the four elements that you mentioned earlier? So this is a question of the pertaining to your review of literature, meaning how far have you gone in terms of reading the literature? Kasi I also noticed na may mga papers naman and readings that are not only focused on practice but also on theory.
Yes po.
So sa number two, since you also agreed to the second assumption, ang question ko niyan is, while you are right, one problem that you may encounter in the process is that P4C and epistemic injustice are not only significant in the level of concept, but most importantly in practice. So ang question nito is that how would you ground your insights without seeing for yourself how epistemic injustice occurs in actual scenario? So this is a question of methodology. Kasi and yun nga, constrained tayo sa pandemic, if it's impossible to witness actual COI and P4C face to face, baka pwede naman sigurong online, like what you're doing ni Doc Marella. I'm sure that's a very novel, and in fact, wala pa akong nababasa na article on P4C na nagdi-discuss about their experiences about handling online committee inquiry. So yun, I think that's a possibility in your thesis, no, na in your experience handling online COIs, what can you actually say and contribute to the existing literature? And lastly, itong third assumption, if you agree to that, ang question ko niyan is, what do you think will you be able to find out in trying to see the connections between epistemic injustice and P4C? So again, I think this goes back to the question of review of literature. How far have you really gone in terms of reading the current scholarship? Thank you and good evening.
Thank you po, Sir Peter. No? I agree that of course, meron din pong mga literature na na-encounter ko na hindi lang naman very practical. With regard to dun sa second question niyo po, yung pagga-ground ng epistemic injustice, I agree that it's going to be a very big challenge on how to, how am I going to discuss epistemic injustice nang hindi siya practically grounded. My my concern about it is, when doing philosophy, there's this very, I don't know, dangerous line, I think, na pag masyado rin tayong kapag ganun po, pag sobrang grounded niya from actual experiences or from actual study, I'm not sure, pero yun yung reservation ko kasi doon. Kaya ang idea ko is to stay on the theories, or to stay on the concept, and to really just analyze whatever Freaker said, and then see everything, kung ano na yung na-publish ng ibang researchers, and then to make sense of it using P4CCOI. Yun yung reservation ko po sa kanya. Hindi ko alam kung parang paano ba, kung will it be acceptable in philosophy kung, for example, maggagawa ako ng totoong study na maghahanap ng epistemic injustices or parang actual experiences. Ayun po. So maybe the other faculty here can help me with that, no, with trying to find or trying to see the line kung kailan ba masyado ng practical na mapupunta na ako sa social science, or mapupunta na ako ng totoo sa education or something, kesa mag-stay lang ako sa philosophy. With yung dun po sa tanong niyo kung what do I think would I uncover, I honestly don't know yet. As I've mentioned right now, I just when I was reading Lippmann and Sharp, and then I got to read Fraker. My idea was simply that whatever they're saying is an answer to this one, and then I saw the four elements I saw that these four elements are unique to P4CCOI, and then I saw that parang na-weirdan pa ako na why aren't more people using P4C COI and trying to make sense of the epistemic injustices of children. Ayun po, right now really the goal lang is to do, maybe interrupt, or maybe even in this in this work in progress, the very idea for me, the very idea that we are talking about epistemic injustice in children, and everyone here I know some way or another are talking or have children in their lives, or you're interacting with the child. I think that's already That's already an achievement for me. Just that very simple interruption, I don't know. Ganun lang po kababaw, I guess, yung goal ko. I'm not sure yet kung ano yung ma-uncover ko, really. Ayun po.
If I may, again, Venus,
Yes, Sir Pao.
Andre,
Go ahead po,
Uh,
Doc Pao.
the question, you had a question, Venus, regarding where you're going to source your or base your how do you call it? Not exactly material, but where are you going to base your the practical aspect of your work? Maybe if you cannot conduct um, uh, let's say a study uh, using or rather study a specific study, or you cannot conduct a study where you could actually observe students face to face. I don't know if if that is necessary. I think you can use and look for case studies, right, that already document examples of or instances of epistemic injustice. And I believe there are many studies of that sort, or case studies of that sort. Um, even and you might want to look at it also from a cultural standpoint, kasi even the way we understand understand education here is uh, uh, the way we understand education here in the Philippines, I think is already an example of in a larger scale, no, an example of epistemic injustice, right? The fact that let's say we favor the big four over other HEIs is already a form of epistemic injustice. And even among those big four, we favor, let's say, students from let's say one university over another university because students from one university can speak English more fluently than students from another university. That already is a form of epistemic injustice. So I think epistemic injustice is a cultural phenomenon. In that sense, it's a systemic problem. Um, and you could actually look at it from that vantage point, if only to put it in that cultural context, right? Uh, Maybe in your introduction, and then you can later on narrow down your discussion and argue that 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 epistemic injustice at that cultural level actually happens even at let's say a more fundamental or grassroots level. I don't know how you're going to um, uh, I call this present that. Um, Pero yeah, that's one of my suggestions. You can look at it from a cultural standpoint, and you don't really need to conduct um, face-to-face studies. I don't know. I don't even. I'm not even sure. Rather, I'm not even sure whether uh, conducting face-to-face um, uh, experiments. I don't know how to call them. Uh, is necessary. Kasi if you look at it from a cultural standpoint, you can already make a case that epistemic injustice is endemic to the culture, or that and that can be corroborated by existing literature, case studies from I don't know. You'll have to look at studies from sociology or education, that may not necessarily be talking about the community of inquiry, but in a way, if they document instant, and they might not even call it epistemic injustice, right? But they may call it using other terms. But if you recognize these instances as instances of epistemic injustice, then they could serve as your I don't know, laboratory perhaps, for lack of a better term. Um, so yun, sige, yun muna.
Thank you po, sir.
Uh, Sir Jesse, before we proceed to your comment, siguro basahin ko lang muna tayo mga comment po na nandito sa chat box po. Okay, from Sir Bjorn Sirad Ramirez, I don't know if this can contextualize the topic. Number one, the reception of Greta Thunberg's activism for climate justice, sorry. And number two, the woke culture. And at the same time, Sir Mark Joseph Dilandingen said that, ayun nga, saan ba makikita yung epistemic injustice? Ano yung exact aspect ng epistemic injustice na pwede isolve ng P4CCOI? I've encountered something similar sa primary years program, International Baccalaureate. This is my last week in training, and when I raised the issue that this may
Andre, na-mute ka.
this may allow students to bring out adult concerns or being deceptive. Sabi lang sa akin, hindi pwede na hayaan na lang na content ng nalalaman ng mga bata. Dapat guided questions lang. Pero okay, open lang ang open inquiry. And ayun po, si Ma'am Venus, may response ka muna. Then, Sir Jesse.
With the comment of Sir Mark Joseph, I'm not familiar po with what you're trying to say. Yung sa cycle of inquiry, hindi ko pa siya alam, pero I'll look into it. With regard dun sa kinento niyo pong experience ninyo, it's really one of the challenges of P4C na I think makes it even harder dito sa Pilipinas, kasi nga yung idea na to allow students or children to actually be part of society building or of curriculum building, it's something very scandalous, 'di ba? Na kasi nga we are operating on these prejudices, we are operating on these assumptions about what being a child is and their capacities as human beings. So ayun po, parang yung in-explain, yung kinento niyo sir example, parang isa siyang example, isa yung mga maraming examples on how society looks at childhood and on how society looks at children. Ayun po. With regard to what Sir Bjorn said, maybe sir you can elaborate on the number 2 that you parang ano pong meron sa woke culture. Yung reception of Greta Thunberg, well, kapag sinasabi nga ng mga tao na bata lang siya, tapos I agree, pwede siyang maging example, lalo na maraming articles about it, even sa parang sa general circulation lang, na parang kung ano ba yung credibility ng isang bata to talk about climate justice or climate change or something. Pero maybe you can elaborate on what you were trying to say with number 2.
Pwede ba akong magsalita? Sorry.
Go ahead, Sir Bjorn.
Okay, regarding dun sa hashtag woke culture, for example, yung mga, kaya gusto ko rin malaman kung ano ba yung categorization ng children. Ano ba to? Minor? Kasi for example, I'm teaching already for 5 years and I had students who are so active, let's say, in Times Up Ateneo. And then, for example, other issues like yung sa Miriam, yung Times Up Miriam when it comes to the issues of some teachers who are taking advantage of students. And then you could see both sides of the discussion. Of course, students who are addressing certain grievances and abuses. And at the same time, there are some people who are commenting, how are they so sure that they are that they are having these experiences? Yung tipong na-invoke na naman yung how are they so sure? They're just children. May mga ganong usapan. So you see, dun mo makikita din, and of course in other issues in society, by the power of Twitter and other social media applications. So yun yung yung parang context ko ng pinanggagalingan ng hashtag woke culture. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you po, sir. Maybe may naisip ako ngayon na baka makasagot din dun sa concern ni Sir Pao kanina, yung contextualization natin ng children. I think magiging very simple lang siya. For example, if I talk about education, let's say the children there are the students. So, pero when, for example, pag sinabi ko naman na sa context ng Pilipinas, I think in the Philippines, people really never cease to being children of their parents. I mean, ganun po. Kasi nga, meron parating authoritarian hold yung parent sa child, yung ganung relationship. Ayun, so, yes, sir. Sir?
Hello po. Saligit lang diyan
Mukhang nabuksan lang po yata yung mic ni Doc Jovi. Ma'am Venus, go ahead po.
Ayun lang naman po na siguro maybe that would be part of me grounding the thesis kapag kailangan kong mamili siguro kung if I will stay in education and talk about pedagogy. So doon clear cut kung sino yung children, or maybe in the Philippines clear cut din. Ayun po. Kasi within the P4CCOI, I think meron din akong na-encounter na siya wala siyang clear cut line na gantong age yung children. Meron lang akong nakitang mga descriptions on what a child is. Pero walang gano'n, parang 18 years old tapos hindi na sila children, ganun po. Sorry, nawala. Ano na po next?
Okay po, thank you Ma'am Venus. Sir Jesse po. Sorry to keep you waiting.
Yeah, hello Venus. Thank you, Andrea. I was wondering about something, siguro perhaps due to my limited reading of P4CCOI. I'm actually asking this because like advocates of P4CCOI, I also like the idea of the equality of intelligences, and yun, I'm curious lang ako yung possibility nila to learn along with us in the form of a community of inquiry. And this is yung question ko, is yung censorship rather, or at least forms and examples of censorship indicative of epistemic justice in the lenses of a P4CCOI framework. Or perhaps the question is if there is any connection between censorship, P4CCOI, and epistemic justice. Imagine ganito, guided reading tayo with children, and the text, let's say 120 Days of Sodom by Marquis de Sade, for example lang, or at least any other text that they're not supposed to read at an early age. And the phrase itself, not supposed to read, already possessing the prejudice because they are at an early age. Something na alam nating masakit sa tenga for any advocate of P4C. So how do we engage in such scenario? I think we already censor these things because of the prejudice on childhood. They could not understand such things at an early age, kaya iniiwasan nating pag-usapan. How do we engage in such scenario?
Thank you, Jesse. I think what's interesting in COI really is it's kung ano yung topic na pag-uusapan nila, or na kung ano yung topic na merong value, it will not actually come from another authoritarian figure, it is the community that decides what is of interest to them. So there in since I am planning on anchoring it on philosophy for children talaga and not just the method of COI, meron doon na you let you let the child guide the discussion in a way, in a sense na kasi kapag nasa community sila and when they're dialoguing with each other, whatever is important to them, it naturally comes out of them. So pagdating sa, I guess, dun sa material, well, I'm not sure what, kung parang kasi dun sa scenario na sinabi mo is binigay na natin yung material, no? Well, kung very practical, in a very practical sense lang, dun sa pag-practice, sa mga practices ng P4CCOI ngayon, as far as I know, they're already operating on, meron ng mga manuals and merong mga literature na available na. And they actually have manuals. And pero yung manuals na yun, it's not for the teacher or it's not for the facilitator to impose on the children. The text is simply presented to them. And then the discussion of the community really parang naturally siya lumalabas. And ayun, dun lalabas kung ano importante sa kanila. With regard to censorship, hindi ko masyadong ma-imagine, no, kasi ano yung ibig mong sabihin dun sa like yun yung text na ibibigay natin sa kanila. Kasi well, yung sa real life naman ngayon, meron ng mga manuals and kasi sabi ko nga, the parang yung mismong P4C COI, nag-evolve na siya into something really practical. Meron na talagang, I mean, ginagawa na siya ng mga maraming tao sa ibang bansa and established na sila din actually sa even sa text na ginagamit nila. Ayun.
Yeah, I also agree dun sa yung idea mo about having the material itself be determined by the community. Yun actually yung siguro hindi siya follow-up question but a follow-up comment. I think yung political or perhaps even ontological import dun sa predicament about censorship and place of censorship in the P4CCOI is perhaps the question of who determines who's to say na bawal nilang basahin, or perhaps who determines who could understand, which is of course I agree with Sir Jovi a while ago and even Sir Pau mentioning that it's a highly epistemological question and not as focused or emphasized in philosophy for children. Yan lang. Thanks, P.
Thank you, Sir Jesse. Siguro we'll just read one last comment for tonight for the presentation of Ma'am Venus. Dr. Marela Bolaños says here that maybe you can include a discussion on philosophy of childhood using Kennedy and Cohen, particularly the adult-child relationship to ground epistemic injustice towards children.
Opo, ay yes po. I think oo nga, parang ganun po. Kasi feeling ko dun sa pinesent kong abstract, no, wala nga po siyang grounding again kung ayun po. Wala siyang grounding kung even kung saan ba nanggagaling yung epistemic injustice. So from what Ma'am Mariela said, I think from here, yung adult-child relationship, baka dun ko na pwedeng ipasok yung idea ng prejudice as the beginning of epistemic injustice. Ayun po. Thank you, ma'am.
Okay, so thank you everyone, and of course thank you Ma'am Venus for the presentation. And I turn the floor to Gerard now as well.
Okay, so good presentation by Ma'am Venus. And our next speaker for tonight is Mr. Andre Mencias, with his presentation entitled Nonviolence in the Wisdom of Love, Reconstructing Emmanuel Levinas' Ethical Responsibility as Nonviolent Resistance. So, Mr. Mencias, you can start your presentation. Andre, naka-mute ka ata.
Okay, hello. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for the time na rin to come to this work in progress seminar. And so what I'm going to present here for today is my thesis proposal on nonviolent resistance and Emmanuel Levinas' ethical responsibility. But before I perhaps start my discussion, a few I just want to make one disclaimer na ang i-represent ko po for today is the thesis proposal that is written in accordance with Dr. Batoon's format. So probably mag-skip lang ng onting I discuss ko for today the abstract, the background of the study, yung thesis statement, and yung review of related literature, just to emphasize and elaborate where I'm coming from and why am I going to work on this research project. So ayun, so start. The several occurrences of tyranny and injustice in history were responded not through the force of violence, but through the force of nonviolent resistance. As an emerging trend of response, Todd May in 2014 philosophically reflected on nonviolent resistance and concluded that there has been a few philosophical reflections on nonviolent resistance. Judith Butler, on the other hand, gave an ethical and political impetus of responding against tyranny with the force of nonviolence. Emmanuel Levinas made a firm stance against violence and war. Victor Tomasevi Bergani, 2015, Howard Cagle, and Simon Critchley in 2007 as Levinas scholars were among the few who wrote on Levinas philosophy with direct relation to nonviolent resistance, as they described the subject as an ethical and political subject for resistance. Other scholars interpreted the nonviolence in Levinas as a descriptive measure. The gap exists as to how one can understand Emmanuel Levinas' concept of ethical responsibility as a form of nonviolent resistance. The study would, so the study will employ a qualitative method using historical interpretive design. The discussion would begin with the interpretation of Levinas' concept of ethical responsibility based on his text within his main works such as Totality, Infinity, and Other Western Being, and his latter works such as the 9 Talmudic Readings, Difficult Freedom, and will end with a reconstruction of his concepts of ethical resistance and permanent revolution based on the descriptions of nonviolence from Judith Butler's The Force of Nonviolence and Todd May's Nonviolent Resistance, a Philosophical Introduction. So the keywords will be Levinas, nonviolence, responsibility, resistance, and the wisdom of love. Okay, a common example of an ethical dilemma that every philosopher, professor of ethics will teach, or even a student of ethics will hear, is the situation to whether one should let a Jew inside their homes during the time of the Nazi regime. Commonly, to let the person in or to drive the person away is a question of morality, especially if one knows of the consequences. One could bear the consequences when the SS knew that someone harbored a person who is considered as an enemy of the state. Clearly, the decision sounds as if it is only left within the politic and the ethical. But to think of it, the consequences are also political in as much as the rules and the concepts of right and wrong are ideologies that are prevailing during that time. From the villagers of Le Chambon in France and the Danish resistance who harbored and protected the people who are considered to be enemies of the state, is a sign of their moral responsibility for the other. Yet such action is also a form of resistance against political injustice. In such a case, one can realize the decision to whether to let the Jew inside to our homes is not only a moral obligation, but it's also a political conviction. And it is with no doubt that when one mentions the terror of the Holocaust, The philosophy of Emmanuel Levinas will continue to be relevant in the criticism of such event. His philosophy continues to resonate the dominance of the memory of the Nazi horror as he describes his life in his autobiographical works of signature. And thus he responded with a philosophy that questioned the very conception of philosophy, a return towards the ethical. He writes that in the preface of the Totality Infinity, a certain form of doubt to whether one is still duped by morality, and if whether peace is still the objective of war. Clearly, he maintains a position that goes against the possibilities of violence, and especially against the idea of war. Therefore, an advocacy towards peace that can be experienced within our lifetime. His philosophy, however, is not something that should be understood as a response against violence and war with the same force or the logic of it. His response go beyond. At the same time, his criticism against war and violence through one's conception of ethical responsibility for the other that disturbs the previous conceptions of philosophy is not a praxis that is simply done towards the other. Rather, it can be extended and it can and must be extended towards the political realm. For if one thinks about it, his criticism of war is not simply against the ontology of it, but it has a political dynamic that questions the idea of politics as simply a suspension of war. Simon Critchley remarks, if ethics without politics is empty, then politics without ethics is blind. Victoria Tamasebi begs the question, if there is no other, then why should there be a question of politics at all? Then Levinas also throws the question, am I my brother's keeper? In this regard, I wish to improvise the question, am I my brother's keeper, and to all my brothers as well? Therefore, the response against the possibilities of war and violence is done for all others to whom we are infinitely responsible to. As Levinas asserts that the epiphany of the face opens the whole of humanity that looks at us in our response towards the other. Likewise, the several occurrences of nonviolent campaigns prove themselves successful in responding against tyrants and injustices within society without the need to return the same form of violence that is done to them. Nonviolence are attempts of responding towards tyranny and injustice within society without the necessity of inflicting violence back toward its opponent. From the Danish resistance in the village of the Le Chambon in France and other occurrences present the possibility of resistance that aims not only of responding to the enemy, rather within the principle of becoming responsible for the other. These examples, as it is linked towards Nazism, is something that has a substantial relevance to Levinas' philosophy of subjects and of communities who chose to become for the other. And as a philosopher who advocates for peace, this is a philosophical trend and an avenue of non-violent resistance where Levinasian philosophy with no doubt should take part in. The writings of nonviolence in relation to Levinas' ethical responsibility has been sparse and lacking. There are only 3 scholars who have made such attempt to write Levinas' philosophy and nonviolence. Simon Critchley wrote in his book, Infinitely Demanding, The Ethics and Politics of Resistance as a way to situate Levinas' philosophy with civil disobedience by imagining a individual subject. The early work sounds interesting as it also indicates its relation to nonviolence. It should be noted, however, that the Critchley's work is written with an amalgamation of different theories of philosophers to prove the notion that the subject to prove a notion of the subject beyond the usual conception of subjectivity as an individual subject that is committed towards an ethics and politics of resistance. Victoria Tamasebi Bergani was one of the pioneers to write on Levinas' ethical responsibilities as it is directly related to nonviolence, which she wrote on her book Emmanuel Levinas and the Politics of Nonviolence. Her book asserts Levinas' ethico-political responsibility can be a form of nonviolence to resist, as she patterns it with Mahatma Gandhi's Satyagraha Ahimsa. Howard Kegel also writes on Levinas' philosophy in regard to nonviolence by exploring the capacities for the subject for nonviolent resistance. So far on nonviolence per se, philosophical reflections are said to be scarce, as Tad may suggest in his book. For his book, Nonviolence Resistance, a Philosophical Introduction, is written on the account of reflecting towards the several occurrences of nonviolent political movements in history, while reflecting towards its pragmatic use of it towards injustices. Judith Butler, on the other hand, recently wrote a book entitled The Force of Nonviolence, which describes a sustained aggression as it proves itself effective in reacting towards violence and injustices within the political realm. The similarity of Butler and May in their stand on nonviolence is how they thought that nonviolence is still inherently violent. At the same time, they both understood that nonviolence as a form of resistance that is done within the political realm against tyranny and violence as well. Critchley, Cahill, and Tomasevi was able to touch these points by reconstructing Levinas ethics into forms of nonviolent resistance. However, they were not able to clarify as to whether civil disobedience is inherently violent in Critchley. Tomasevi did not went as far as seeing Levinas ethico-political thought can be inherently violent. Therefore, there are two gaps. First is how the two scholars was not able to clarify their interpretation of Levinas as inherently violent, as they reconstructed his philosophy as forms of nonviolence. It resonates the Derridian argument against Levinas of the inevitability of violence, even in responsibility, of which the argument remains relevant. This ironically implies that even the attempt of ending possibilities of violence, there is still an inherent form of violence within the praxis itself. Levinas tries to solve this problem within the idea of the wisdom of love. Critchley and Tomasevi wasn't able to conceptualize this idea further as to answer the problem. Therefore, a second gap exists and also an interesting idea to explore. So this will be the statement of the problem. So the main problem of my thesis is understanding how can Levinas ethical responsibility be reconstructed to be a form of nonviolent social political practice or nonviolent resistance. And it says minor problems. First, I will discuss how did Levinas qualified and use the term nonviolent in his ethical responsibility. Second, how can Levinas ethical and political be connected towards nonviolence as a political praxis? And third, how can Levinas' concept of ethical resistance and permanent revolution be reconstructed as a form of nonviolent resistance? So this Smithy's statement to illustrate how the idea of ethical resistance can be reconstructed as a form of nonviolent resistance or nonviolence. So I will have, at this point, I will have to jump to the review of related literature. Sorry. The intention of the research project is to present another perspective as to how Levinas' ethical responsibility can be illustrated as a form of nonviolence. It is important to note that in doing so, one needs to provide a starting point in Levinas' philosophy to contextualize the discussion. Levinas has mentioned the term nonviolence in a way of describing his ethical responsibility as found in totality and infinity. This concept illustrates that in the encounter with the other to the face, the subject hears the message of thou shalt not kill, an appeal to non-murder, yet it still urges one to be violent. Thus a conflict between violence and non-violence. Several of the literature are written on the usage of Levinas' usage of the term of nonviolence, specifically on this idea of ethical resistance. This review, therefore, is to survey the current literature written on the topic and to evaluate and as to qualify how scholars have interpreted the term nonviolence in relation to Levinas' philosophy. So Anya Topolsky would define Levinas' ethics as a nonviolent way in a way of using the notion of language. Language, as Topolsky would re-echo Levinas, becomes the medium to where the subject and the other would meet in the face-to-face. This encounter through the use of language, therefore, is described to be nonviolent as it is said to go beyond the structures of ontology. Similarly, William Large's introduction to Levinas' philosophy also considers the idea of speech or language as the basis for a nonviolent ethical relation. For it is in speech where both the other and the subject, while they retain their differences or heteronomy, they undergo a form of discourse wherein speech becomes the medium for the discourse, and it is also in speech where he understands Levinas that it signifies not the content of the message, but the very presence of the other. What both scholars discuss here is the idea how the ethics of Levinas go beyond the ontological structures of becoming for the other to the use of language. This implies that ontological structure presupposes forms of conditions in ethics in which Levinas opposed, and at the same time, it also entails how the structure of knowledge has a reductionist tendency against the other, in which is considered to be violent to Levinas. Expounding upon the idea of nonviolent form of ethics, Edith Vishkogrod would equate the idea of nonviolence as non-compelling in Levinas ethics. In the very encounter with the other where he expressed the command of thou shalt not kill, this commandment was not necessarily a command, but rather it solicits the responsibility to the subject. It is nonviolent in the sense that the idea of solicitation is an act that does not necessarily impede the subject's heteronomy and freedom. Yet it is important to note that heteronomy for Levinas, as Vishkogrod echoes, is a condition of the subject as an absolute passivity for alterity in which such condition opens the possibility of becoming responsible to the other as he is exposed to suffering. Therefore, the idea of solicitation becomes a vital concept in interpreting Levinas ethics as nonviolent. For it is in the very condition of the subject to be sensible to his suffering, in which the other solicits his responsibility towards him. In another part of what Vishkogrod would mention the idea of nonviolence of Gandhi as it is alluded to Levinas philosophy, yet this was not further expounded upon. To complement Vishkogrod's idea and a peaceful relation with the other, Roger Burgrave refers to Levinas ethics as nonviolent, that the plea of the other for help is a disarming authority. When the other speaks the first message of thou shalt not kill, such plea disarms the subject's tendency for violence. The experience of having to hear the disarming authority in the other implies that one is exposed to suffering, and how such experience of the other suffering disarms the subject. At this point, the scholars interpreted that nonviolence in Levinas, in terms of the absence of language, goes in two ways. First, the use of language as it goes beyond ontology. Second, and how the forcelessness of the commandment of thou shalt not kill emphasizes the idea of the possibility of solicitation for responsibility. Topolsky emphasizes on the idea of language that simply entail of an ethics that go beyond ontological structures. Vishkogrod and Burgrave creates a novel interpretation of the other's first message. However, there is a problem on the statement of the using of language as the medium for ethics in order to be described as nonviolent. Jacques Derrida, a former student of Levinas, gave his famous critique of his philosophy in the monograph dedicated to him, entitled Levinas and Violence and Metaphysics. The lengthy monograph written by Derrida provides insights that puts Levinas' philosophy into question, especially on the idea of his ethics as described as nonviolent. While Levinas would argue that in becoming responsible to the other, one must choose to become nonviolent, in contrast to inflicting violence towards him in the encounter with the face. Derrida would, however, argue two things. First is the impossibility of doing away with metaphysics or ontology in asserting ethics as primordial, for ontology would demand an actual presence and therefore violent. There is a need for ontology or metaphysics in order for one to actually see the other's presence. Secondly, when Levinas argues that it is through the language that one can escape the violence in ontology, one cannot become fully free from violence and responsibility when language is itself violent. But violence here does not necessarily mean physical violence, rather violence in the sense in what Levinas means in knowledge, where the subject has the tendency to intellectualize the other or to simply put him into a concept. Therefore, to combat existing violence, we'll have to use a form of violence, an economy of violence. The economy of violence, as Derrida proposes, is how he imagines a practical analysis on Levinas' ethics. A year after the passing of Levinas, Derrida wrote a tribute to his former mentor in the Adieu to Emmanuel Levinas, where he would pay his respects in outlining Levinas' philosophy and his contribution to philosophy, and then would innovate his responsibility with the notion of hospitality. Derrida stresses that Levinas' idea of dwelling as a pacific relation with the other while welcoming him in the world. Bernasconi, on the other hand, would appreciate Derrida's reading of Levinas. He argues that Derrida opens a significant discourse when he questions Levinas' notion of violence. What he, however, argues against Derrida or other readers of Derrida who questions Levinas is their failure to read Levinas' second main work of Other Wasting Being or Beyond Beyond Essence, and other readings where Levinas could have addressed the problem that Derrida posed. Bernasconi would conclude Derrida was not able to explore the other works where Levinas would admit to certain necessary violence or totality in reference to the establishment of state and politics. What Bernasconi offers in this article is how he tends to clarify that even Levinas would consider the idea of necessary violence, but it's in relation to the idea of nonviolence. As Derrida contests as impossible in Levinas' ethics, Bernasconi would point out that certain violence may be allowed, but the possibilities where injustice and extreme forms of violence can be resisted through the idea of good conscience, when good conscience can be found within institutions that alienate the subject, which is necessary in order to maintain order and peace, and how one can still maintain subjectivity while consenting to be at peace with others. This way of understanding comes in similar to that of Vichkogrod and Burgrave. At this juncture, the Derridian critique opens the dimensions of understanding Levinas' philosophy in re-evaluating its relationship with ontology. When it comes to the idea of necessary violence, of totalities, and of structures as necessary in one's engagement to the world, it opens the realm of the political in Levinas' philosophy. Entering to the political implies the need for necessary violence. Peter Atherton writes on Levinas' usage of nonviolence in another text, particularly in his polemic on Simone Weil entitled Simone Weil Against the Bible, where Levinas questioned the idea of Christian love and nonviolence as inefficient and its capability to become complicit to violence. Atherton writes in his article, Levinas' Justice and Just War, as an evaluation of the notion of justice. For justice as a way to reconcile between the other and the third, it would then presuppose the possibility of violence, just as how Derrida asserts. Therefore, Atherton would conclude in his article that the roles of charity and mercy as a way to temper the necessary violence. What Atherton provides in his interpretation is how he comes from the Derrida's argument against Levinas, where there is still an inevitability of violence, yet he contextualizes this necessity of violence within the political realm, where there is a need to reconcile between two others, specifically the other and the third. The uniqueness of his assertion comes from Levinas' criticism of the Christian notion of nonviolence, as he gives a more concrete way of allowing necessary violence, but tempered with charity and mercy. In speaking of necessary violence, structures, and the idea of charity, yet again, in another part of Burgrave's book, The Wisdom of Love in the Service of Love, Emmanuel Levinas on Justice, Peace, and Human Rights, the necessary violence that is found within political structures can be converted into a society of non-violence or a peaceful society. In order to transform the inherent violence in socio-political structures, it needs the wisdom of love as a part of the political structure for which it can translate the logic of politics from egocentric arbitrariness to a structure that aims towards the other. In another part, the role of love is encapsulated within the idea of justice in choosing and thematizing the other. And the third pushes for a humanization of structures as well. Such assertion of Burgrave comes from the idea of human rights should be recentered to the ethical, specifically on the criticism towards death penalty. This in a way complements how Levinas penetrates the political realm in allowing the idea of ethical responsibility to be recentered. This interpretation complements the idea of Atherton, but it focuses on the structures of society and politics. Corey Beals thinks that the idea of the wisdom of love of Levinas could also have an ethical and political foundation. The highlight of the book, Levinas and the Wisdom of Love, the question of invisibility, gives a comprehensive definition of what it means to need the wisdom of love that goes beyond the idea of wisdom in the epistemological sense, but rather in the ethical sense. While Beals gives gives a comprehensive examination of the wisdom of love, the author gives the example of the village of Les Chambon, where people harbored Jewish refugees escaping from the Nazi terrors. There is a political dynamic of such case implies that the rest of the village harbored refugees without hesitation, and it was not simply done by one person alone. She argued that it was the idea of invisibility, of becoming responsible, that resists an authority of power. Bills also views it as a form of revolt against injustices that is guided under the ethical of becoming responsible for the other. What is interesting to note about Corey Bills is how she was able to give an example as to how the wisdom of love can become revolutionary, as it is against injustices within the example of the villagers of Le Chambon. Burgravi also mentions the idea of permanent revolution in his book that gives a description that revolution is something that is grounded in the ethical and political structure of society, as it is a revolutionary dynamite that aims to criticize social political structures under the guiding principle of becoming for the other. While both talks about revolt, Bills and Burgravi give a consistent description of what makes a revolution in an ethical sense. Bills gives a vivid example of Le Chambon. However, it is not clear whether Bills would consider the act of invisibility and visibility of the villagers as a form of non-violence, as it is a form of revolt. Yet, the villagers did not respond with force. It opens an aperture of becoming a form of non-violent resistance. Tad May, who wrote on nonviolence, gave also an example of the Danish resistance, where its citizens were able to save Jews by providing shelter and refuge as a form of resistance against Nazism. Thus, this may strengthen this claim to nonviolence. Among which who wrote on the political, Judith Butler writes 2 articles on Levinas where she labels it as a Jewish ethic of nonviolence. In her first article entitled The Precarious Life, she understood that the encounter of the face in the message thou shalt not kill entails a message that elicits suffering. She defines the idea of precarious life as she borrows it from Levinas as a realization of life as precarious when one answers towards the message of the other in becoming responsible for him. Butler understands nonviolence as the very anxiety of committing violence and undergoing the violence of the self. There lies tension in defending oneself, in the sense to kill the other, or to undergo the suffering to become responsible for him. However, Butler would insist that one must be able to overcome these tendencies, for it is the condition of the face where it communicates suffering is what makes life precarious. Ruth Velten, on the other hand, describes nonviolence in Levinas' philosophy as a messianic promise as to interrupt the conflict of inflicting violence and to undergo violence. Velten agrees that violence is already presupposing the condition of responsibility. Yet he would argue that despite of which, to be responsible is to be able to quell the power of inflicting violence that go against the other. Similarly, that these two people would seem to view the idea of nonviolence in Levinas ethics as a form of a challenge to become responsible towards the other despite the inevitability of the violence, in this case from the self. Her other article on the other hand, precarious life, vulnerability, and the ethics of cohabitation would seem to be an extension of precarious life, where she takes the idea of vulnerability and proximity in Levinas' theory and uses Hannah Arendt's cohabitation as the condition for nonviolence. Butler here stresses that in being sensible with the suffering of the other as being egoless imposes an unchosen demand of the other for responsibility. Likewise, in Arendt's theory, in being part with the world that allows one to participate in the political realm. Butler's writings give another dynamic as to how Levinas' philosophy can be understood within the political without touching the idea of the third. This is a vis-a-vis approach of Butler's writing not only opens the political, but it gives flesh and vividness to Levinas' philosophy as it can be imagined in the world. And in such a way, her analysis on Levinas makes her a good reader of his philosophy. Some scholars wrote on the idea of nonviolence as a form of pacifism. Arya Cohen describes Levinas' ethics as a form of pacifism. His pacifism, as it is in vis-a-vis with the Jewish Talmudic thinker Aharon Shmuel Tamares, that examines the idea of becoming ethical, puts an end towards violence and war. Supporting their argument and interpretation, Andrew Fleischer asserts that analyzing Levinas' philosophy, as well as Tamales, may give a substantial criticism of the Jewish sovereignty. This criticism is within the backdrop of the problems within Zionism and its tendency for violent means. To be non-violent, therefore, is to resist one's tendency to become violent, especially in the context of politics, in the very assertion against sovereignty. These ideas are similar to the ideas of Butler that one needs to overcome the tendencies towards violence. Sean Lawrence, on the other hand, would describe Levinas' ethic as a form of pacifism, not as an inhibition to inflict violence, rather as a form of critique of social and political structures. Lawrence understood that the use of Levinas' term of nonviolence as a peaceful relation of the subject and the other without egoism, therefore to be living in peaceful relation with the other, despite of our own alterities, plurality. One can see how important it is to put the idea of becoming responsible towards the other in the political realm. This criticism therefore lies within the possibility of realizing the notion of peace as becoming responsible to the other that interrupts the totalities of politics and of society. So far, the literature has been discussed only on the idea of nonviolence in Levinas' philosophy as a peace between the subject and the other in this intersubjective encounter. The literature entails how the idea of nonviolence can only be understood in political, but in so far as nonviolence is considered as a political praxis that react against tyranny, Levinas' idea of nonviolence within ethical responsibility falls short as how it can be projected towards the socio-political realm. Therefore, there is a need to imagine Levinas' philosophy as a form of nonviolence if his philosophy is indeed geared towards ending it, other than understanding it within the intersubjective and towards the political. The following part of the review would then survey what has been written in this endeavor. Among the literature of the discussion of nonviolence as social political action and a resistance towards violence coming from structural and or physical violence and against oppressive regimes and tyrannical figures, to view nonviolence as social-political action, the researcher tends to pinpoint references coming from Judith Butler and Todd May. Todd May, in his writing of nonviolent resistance, a philosophical introduction, viewed the philosophical reflections on nonviolence as a social-political practice is sparse. He also provides a rich historical outline of different campaigns that transpired throughout the world within the political, from Gandhi to Martin Luther King. At the same time, he notes that the idea of nonviolence should be understood not only on the grounds of principle, but also reflected pragmatically. He goes far by illustrating ways on how nonviolent resistance can be an effective given the certain conditions. Judith Butler, on the other hand, writes on the idea of nonviolence and asserting of the importance of the other as grievable in her book, The Force of Nonviolence. Butler's recently published work seems to be a culminating view of nonviolence coming from her previous writings. The book stresses on an ethical and political dynamic towards nonviolence insofar as to react against violence is for the preservation of the other's life, precisely because of one's recognition of an ontology of interdependency between people. This in turn creates a claim for universality that all life should be considered precarious or grievable. Butler examines whenever instances of violence persist in society will always call for an action against it. That she examines that there is such thing as a force whenever one talks about the idea of violence, and we are within what she so calls a force field of violence. In this case, she notes that nonviolence as well as becomes a viable response that does not necessarily use the blow of violence inflicted, and how one can live in the world where violence consistently persists. Therefore, she notes on the idea of nonviolence as a form of sustained aggression. However, it is important to note that there is a deviation from Levinas in this book. Yet one can still see Levinas' influence in the book, especially in the chapter of grievability. The strength of both authors is how they're able to reflect on nonviolence with a philosophical lens. They both, however, noted that non-violence as a praxis, despite being a reactionary to violence, is still violent. This would then reflect Derrida's argument of the inevitability to escape violence, even in pursuing a peaceful revolt against tyranny. It is interesting to note that some Levinasian scholars have attempted to write on his philosophy with direct relation to nonviolence. Simon Critchley would also wrote on civil disobedience with ideas borrowed from Levinas, where the condition of the subject as individual or a split subject, and anarchism, where the subject is placed on the demand of the other, and that allows for the possibility of such action. For civil disobedience, it is also known as a form of nonviolence. This idea of Critchley, however, while it talks about the ethics and politics of resistance, it is also written in the amalgamation of ideas from different philosophers and not solely on Levinas. The earlier work of Critchley already hints the idea of nonviolence as socio-political praxis, especially as how he alludes the idea of civil disobedience with the remnants of Levinas philosophy. However, one should be careful about his work, as he does not talk about nonviolence and Levinas directly. Civil disobedience is a form of nonviolence, and at the same time, the book comprises of several ideas of philosophers improving his thesis to have an ethics and politics of resistance. However, there's only one material written directly on nonviolence as socio-political praxis that is directly related with Levinas. The book of Victoria Tamasebi-Bergani's Emmanuel Levinas, The Politics of Nonviolence, is written with the intention of viewing responsibility that can be a form of liberatory praxis of entering towards injustices within the political realm. Tamasebi-Bergani writes a novel reading of Levinas' ethical responsibility that patterns Mahatma Gandhi's idea of nonviolence of Satyagraha Ahimsa, and at the same time correlates their similarities. What Tamasebi-Bergani's contribution to the discourse of nonviolence is how responsibility for the other becomes the very condition for nonviolence. Her discussion is anchored as to how the subject can be understood as a political subject that is responsible not only on the other, but also the third, and at the same time, the subject is also considered as a third that can be responsible on behalf of others. Also, she noted that the idea of love in Levi's philosophy becomes the condition of the subject to be sensible for the suffering of the other and of the third as well. What is surprising, however, that she noted that the idea of love in Levinas has no political dynamic or cannot be imagined in the political. This innovative reading of Levinas underscores a more concrete idea of how Levinas can be considered in the political realm, as Amanda Lomansky reviews the book of Tamasebi. She asserts that Tamasebi's book proves that Levinas' responsibility can still be relevant and not just to be limited as a pious discourse. Lumansky, however, poses a challenge that her book could have been written in response towards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Howard K. Gill also made an interpretation of Levinas' philosophy in terms of resistance or defiance. K. Gill, as a reader of Levinas, writes in his book on Defiance, A Philosophy of Resistance, a reflection on the idea of resistance and what does it mean to resist and divide against war and violence. The logic that underlies within K. Gill on the idea of resistance is the tension between resistance and power, or the logic of violence and the capacity to resist violence. Overall, he explores the politics of resistance as highly considers the concept of nonviolence as a form of valid resistance that is worth of philosophical reflection. He dedicated a small chapter on Levinas by asserting the value of nonviolence through the ethical. K. Gill asserts that nonviolence is a form of resistance against violence or war may have the risk to perpetuate further violence. He follows the argument of Levinas from the preface of the Totality and Infinity, wherein Levinas makes a suspicion of peace of empires that is only possible within war. That peace in that sense is simply as a war suspended within the play of politics. He therefore re-echoes Levinas' idea of the eschatology of peace that aspires a response against violence that go beyond the logic of war, and Gill's insightful contribution is reiterating the concept of the enemy in Levinas' ethics. To recognize oneself as becoming an enemy of the enemy, one must realize that even the enemy himself is an other that is recognized through the infinite. Therefore, the other is also an enemy that is also subjected to ethical responsibility of answering towards him through responsibility. Ano ba yan? So before I proceed, siguro I'll just skip to the synthesis na lang since we only have 10 minutes. So ayun.
Andre,
Yes, Gerard.
pero ano mo na, I think you should wrap up siguro.
Synthesis na.
In order to have time for questions and suggestions regarding.
Yeah, sorry, I apologize for the siguro I'll just present the synthesis na lang. Or siguro I'll just wing it na lang siguro from here. So ang main ng discussion ko here is that there's a possibility of understanding Levinas' ethical responsibility as a form of nonviolent resistance. But I am using the frameworks of Judith Butler and Todd May to define what nonviolent resistance is and how it can be, kumbaga yun yung parang the very definition of it and kung paano ko reconstruct yung idea of ethical responsibility ni Levinas doon. So far, yung literature is only ano siya sa parang nagfo-focus lang siya on the consideration of the subject as a political subject lang. Pero medyo kulang pa yung idea kung paano exactly ang ethical responsibility as a form of nonviolence talaga. So siguro I'll stop na lang muna for there and thank you po.
Thank you, Sir Andre, for your presentation regarding your research. So, the meeting is now open for questions and suggestions regarding Mr. Mencias' research. Okay, so you may type in the chat box questions, or you may unmute so that you can be recognized.
Tulog na yata yung mga kasama natin. Gerard, can I just
sorry po.
start? Just ask a quick question. Just
yes, Doc. You may ask Mr. Mencias.
Yeah, so that we could just start the the open forum. So Andre, so thank you for that presentation. I'd like to ask if that is that is the proposal that you're going to submit to the graduate school, right? Yeah, it's rather long for a proposal, but nevertheless, I am glad that you presented basically your literature review, which is quite exhaustive in a way. So I don't know, kasi I was looking at your what you shared with us, the paper. It's around 10,000 words, no? And it's in single space. So kung gagawin mong double space yan, it's as good as an undergraduate thesis already. But anyway, you are writing an MA thesis. Now, I don't really have a specific question, but just so I could clarify with you what I got from your presentation, and if I got it correctly, what you intend to do in your thesis. So as you said, you are and you are going to base your reconstruction of the idea of nonviolence using Todd May and Judith Butler. Uh, and then you're going to use them as springboard to illustrate a philosophy of nonviolence, a Levinasian philosophy of nonviolence, parang ganon. What is it? I just like to ask then, what is it in Todd May? And maybe you have already mentioned it in your presentations, just that because it was quite lengthy, baka na wala sa aking, I wasn't able to receive it. What is it exactly in Todd May and Judith Butler that you think could help you illustrate a Levinasian theory of nonviolence? Something that's not something that you cannot find in Levinas. What is it in Butler and Todd May that you don't already find in Levinas? So yun lang muna.
Okay po, Doc. First po, for Todd May po kasi po, Doc, ang nagusto ko sa idea po kasi from his book is mas elaborate yung discussion niya on the idea of nonviolence. Parang talagang hinimay-himay niya talaga yun. So definition-wise, maganda yung ni Todd May. And of course, yung examples din na niya, lalo na yung the Danish resistance. Kasi yung, in a way, medyo very close yan sa ni Levinas. And at the same time, kay Judith Butler, yung sabi ko ay, ang interesting kay Judith Butler is the idea that maganda yung reading niya kay Levinas, especially kung paano niya naitawid yung ethical responsibility towards the political. Pero na medyo iba yung way kung paano niya nagawa. Ang interesting nga lang po dun, Doc, is that nagkaroon siya ng disconnect nung dumating siya sa The Force of Nonviolence. Parang nung earlier writings, maingay talaga yung niya, very pero at the same time, nung The Force of Nonviolence na, wala na, parang halos hindi niya na na-mention sa Levinas. So, ano yung hindi ko nakita kay Levinas? Ganito po kasi, this is the kasi whenever we talk about the political in Levinas, ang pinaka mahirap kasing intindihin, everyone stopped kasi reading Levinas at Totality Infinity. Almost everyone. Lalo na nung Totality Infinity was criticized by Jacques Derrida's Violence and Metaphysics, everybody stopped reading Otherwise Than Being, which was a response towards Derrida. Now, Otherwise Than Being opens the idea of the third, idea of the political. And doon parang mas in-introduce pa lang doon ni Levinas kasi discussion. The problem about it is that, well, I'm not going to say na hindi si Levinas, hindi siya explicit about it. He was. However, yung political convictions niya, yung political writings niya, mahahanap mo na siya sa mga, it is scattered towards his confessional. Yung mga Judaic readings niya, yung Judaic writings niya. Kaya biglang lumitaw yung idea of permanent revolution as an ever-changing or ever-striving better justice na pwedeng gamitin as a form of critic. Pwede siguro na yung sabing critic. So, kaya ang nangyari doon, dahil doon sa disconnect na yon, yung gap na yon, I'm not gonna say gap, pero dahil doon sa problem nakita ko yon, secondary scholars already reinterpreted it. Sila na yung gumawa ng mas elaborate na discussion, kaya meron yung mga interpretations ni Roger Burgrave, mas madami nang nag-appropriate na mismo. Ang ginawa nila is that they connect the dots with each other to make a sensible way on how to understand Levinas' idea of politics. Pero ayun nga lang po, ang pinakamahalaga kong sigurong na yung po kasi yung hindi ko nakita at first sight. Pero when I discovered the ideas of permanent revolution, doon ko na found out na may revolutionary understanding din si Levinas. May pagka-revolutionary siya. I mean, if you are to think of it, if Levinas was indeed a critic against all kinds of injustices, how radical was he to actually go against structures? Yun yung parang nakita ko doon na gaano siya ka radical about it. And siguro the idea of permanent revolution is siguro perhaps I could safely assume that it is non-violent in a sense na pasok siya sa definitions ni Padme na it is a response against the opponent while preserving the dignity and the equality, the dignity and the quality of the person. So yun po muna for me. Thank you po.
Okay, so there is a comment, no, from
Ayun
the
na
chat
lang.
box,
Sige.
no, from Sir Mark, no, Sir Mark Landini. No? So first question niya is, so psychoanalytic post-structural ahimsa lens kay Levinas. So yun daw ba yung balak mong
Actually, lalayo ako kay Gandhi kasi nagawa na yun eh. Talagang mas elaborate na yung discussion on Gandhi. So medyo lalayo ako sa discussion. Pero although I would use yung yung ideas niya ng Satyagraha Ahimsa, pero lalayo medyo ko doon. Okay.
And then there's another one, no, still from Sir Mark. Paano yung love your enemy in relation sa non-violent resistance? 'Di ba delusion yata, no? 'Di ba delusion yan si Padme ata?
Yeah, Padme is delusion. Yun nga yung parang naging introduction namin dun sa course. Now, yun na nga yung yung love your enemy, mas radicalize yung ethical responsibility dun eh. Na talagang in order to non-violence to happen, in order to be possible, you have to be responsible towards the other. You have to be responsible towards the other na hindi ka mag-i-inflict ng violence. However, ito yung parang problem dito nga kay Levinas. What if you are confronted with two others, diba? So anong gagawin mo? Yun na doon na papasok yung politics. Now, if that's the case, you can choose the other, siguro yung immediate other, yung first other naman, and that's okay. Kasi that is tempered naman. If your conviction to go towards the third other is tempered towards the conviction of the wisdom of love. Kasi nga tinetemper ng wisdom of love yung inherent violence dun. And yun nga, so when we are going to love your enemy and we are going to be responsible towards him, we have to act in such a way na hindi, of course, hindi masasaktan yung other. Now, laliman pa natin yung let's complicate things. What if the third hurts the other? Di ba sinabi ni Levinas na to be responsible is to be non-violent. Doon papasok yung limits niya na doon pumapasok yung limits ng non-violence ni Levinas na hindi na pwede kong pigilan yung I can intervene, I can use violence against the third who is hurting the other, provided of course that my responsibility, that despite of its violence, is still tempered. Ayun po. And siguro yung kay Zizek, I haven't read kasi the Zizek Levinas polemic, although I've been hearing about it na may mga ano na si Jack. Ayun po. Gerard, meron yata nagtaas ng kamay kanina.
Wait. Wala.
Okay.
So far, wala akong nakikitang nag-raise ng hand. Pero if you want to ask Mr. Mencias about his work, you may do so. You know, you may unmute or chat, type it in the chat. So, so napindot lang ni Sir Kim, no? Si DBA Morialdo is Sir Kim Villesca, no? Napindot lang daw niya yung button. So if I think we can entertain siguro a question. Yes, Doc Pao, no, I think yes, last question. If there is a question for Andre. No? But I think there's no more questions regarding your presentation. So thank you very much, Andre, for your
Thank you, Gerard.
For your proposal. No, it's very informative. So thank you very much. Okay, so I think we can give.
Okay, so thank you po. With that, we end the session for this month. See you po next month again. Thank you po very much for attending.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much po sa pakikinig.